Hello, composers. Before we get started, please keep in mind that there is a concert scheduled on the course page. Please be there early to set up and get things going if you can. You will need to provide feedback for all of the pieces on the concert, so take notes so you can submit the feedback form later. This week, we're going to look at vocal music, specifically setting text to music. To allay any fears, no, you do not have to write your own texts. I don't write my own, mostly because they tend to end up sounding like a bad combination of lyrics from Nine Inch Nails and The Cure. Instead, I outsource the job to an actual writer, and believe me, English majors are always happy to collaborate in my experience. But if they're not available, where can you go to get high-quality texts? Especially those texts that don't require paying royalties to someone. U.S. copyright law is vague and generally in flux in terms of what can and cannot be considered under copyright. A good rule is that anything fiction or nonfiction from 1923 or earlier is probably okay, although you should still double check. Exceptions exist for scholarly editions of works or newly updated versions of works. Note that this is what keeps a lot of the works of Emily Dickinson under copyright. A great source, aside from commissioning a new text from a friend, is Project Gutenberg, which hosts public domain royalty-free texts in a variety of formats like plain text, HTML, or various ebook formats. For fiction and poetry in particular, this is a great site with over 59,000 texts to choose from. For nonfiction or ephemera, like advertisements, the Internet Archive is your best bet. Their text collection is currently at 15 million public domain items and counting, all of which can be downloaded and used in any way you so desire. Be aware, though, that they also have partnered with libraries to allow borrowing of ebooks. So anything that requires a login is probably not public domain. Still, though, there are some really interesting random texts there. Things like pamphlets on how to use remote control, hilariously discredited scientific papers from the 1940s, public domain or Creative Commons licensed texts uploaded by users, which are great to use. Just be sure to follow the license terms like requiring attribution, non-commercial use only, or share alike for the resulting piece so that other people can remix your own work. And of course, there's some of the most random stuff you will ever see on that particular site. There are others, of course. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France has Gallica, which is an exceptional source of open culture books, images, and other generally wonderful things that are free to download. As is Wikibooks, which is part of the Wikimedia Foundation, which also includes Wikipedia. These will get you started with finding texts that you can use. But what if there is no perfect text and you don't have the financial means to bribe an English major to write one for you? Well, let's get creative and maybe a little surreal. The Exquisite Corpse is a classic surrealist game or technique for generating works. One person starts the drawing or the text and completes a few lines. They then pass it to the next person who does the same. In some instances, each person folds the paper so that the next person cannot see the previous contributions, or so that they can only see the very last line and use that as their starting point or point of departure. Needless to say, this gets really interesting really quickly. Related to this is the author William S. Burroughs' cut-up technique. Take a fully finished linear text and cut it into fragments of a word or a few sequential words. Then rearrange them however you will. Obviously, you're going to want to either print things out or go to a used bookstore and get the cheapest books you can find for this. Generally, this is not something that can be considered a copyright violation, as it is way too difficult to figure out what work you may be using. Related to this is the idea of randomization. Open a book to a random page, pick a random word, and write it down. Dictionaries, Shakespeare, textbooks, or you can even use an internet-based randomizer to generate random words based on character length, number of syllables, or any other parameters you decide to use. This works really well in conjunction with the cut-up technique to inject some interesting ideas into a text. Think of this as magnetic poetry with even more randomness. Of course, if you're going into a more digital rather than analog world, there are a number of computer tools that produce similar effects. Noetry is one of these methods. A set of source texts are loaded into a computer, text format only, no PDF or HTML files, it will not work with those. Then you give each text a probability weight, select a poetic meter or create one from scratch, and the program will generate a new text in the form of a poem from the existing ones. Words can be saved in position, and then the remaining parts can be regenerated. With a little patience and some editing of punctuation, really powerful and interesting texts can be randomly generated in this way. In fact, this is how I generated all of the texts used in my piece for solo percussionist and narrator, Illusions and Evocations, and in my song cycle, Needlepoint. There are a number of programs and methods available. Check out the software list at Noetry Daily, but JNoetry is probably the best to start with as it runs in a web browser and is really easy to use. Once you have a text, you'll need to set it. We'll start in the next video by looking at rhythm and speech.